Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm your host, Steve Doyle. You know, there are certain individuals in our hobby who really need very little introduction. And I am pleased to say that we have one of these people with us today. Otto Penzler needs little introduction. Otto is well known in the genre of crime and detective fiction as a writer, an editor, a publisher, a book dealer, an anthologist, and a book collector. And his collection of mystery and detective fiction, which he recently sold at auction, is largely considered to have been unparalleled ever. Otto is also a Sherlockian and a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And he is the proprietor of the Mysterious Bookshop in Manhattan. And I'm very happy to welcome him to the show. So, hello, Otto. How are you doing?
I'm great. Hi, Steve. Nice to be with you.
So nice to see you, coming from what I believe is the basement of the Mysterious Bookshop in Manhattan.
It's the basement, but it's also our offices. My assistant, my publisher, my shipping room, storage of overstocked books and so on. They're all down here. We have about, I'm going to say 1,400 square feet down here, about 2,000 square feet on the first floor of the bookshop. So it's not very much smaller. So here we are.
Well, I'm pretty familiar with with your space down there, just because of being able to visit in January. I know you have you have a ton of Sherlockiana upstairs, but you also have, I think, some even rarer or more desirable items down in the basement. So I love to dive down there and see what's there. So
what we have down here, I mean, it is the whole back wall, as you know, is Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes material. So there's a lot of books there. Downstairs, there are some duplicates of what's upstairs because there's just, even with the whole back wall, and the wall's 15 feet high with the rolling ladder. So there's a lot of books. Yeah, there's a lot of space, a lot of shelf space for Sherlockian material, but instead of having 4 copies of the same book on the shelf, we'd rather have more different titles. So some of the overstock comes down here, but also the better books, and some of them go into the hundreds of dollars, and some go into the thousands, as I know you know. Mm-hmm. I don't really like having those handled every day by people who just casually walk in off the street and said, "Oh, I like Sherlock Holmes. What's this?" You know, and they'll pull a book down from the shelf and say, "Oh, you know, it's $1,000 book. You just tore the jacket, and now it's $100 book." So I keep those downstairs, but not just Sherlockian material. There's a lot of other rare books down here as well, but it's the Sherlockian shelves down here that are most interesting, which I opened for the Baker Street Irregulars banquet day, the day of the banquet. We've had an open house at my bookshop for 41 straight years.
That's amazing.
Until this
year. It really is. I think I went to I've been going to the BSI dinner now. I can't now that I'm doing the math in my head, for over 20 years. And I think I've been to your shop every year.
I think you have too.
Yeah. It's a
there are certain people who come every year, and if they don't, I worry that there's something wrong with them, because I know they like coming to the store. I know they like browsing. I know they like seeing their friends, because our open house, we have, you know, as you know, so many people come by. And if they don't come by, I think, is everybody okay? And it's, they usually are, and they just didn't want to buy it. They didn't want to shop, or they come another day, you know, because it goes for a week. It's a Sherlockian week. It starts on Monday.
I know. I remember in the good old days when of Wessex Press, Gasgene Books, we would be getting our books to you, and you're like, "I'd like to get them a day earlier."
Yeah,
It's like, what? Nobody, and people are coming before your open house. What's up with that?
all week. There's the very serious collectors actually show up on Wednesday. Uh, and I won't mention names because they may not like to be identified as fanatics, but they are, which I was in my day when I was collecting also. They show up 2 days early to make sure that they get first look at the very best books, the rarest, most obscure, arcane material.
Well, we'll talk about book collecting in a minute, but I'd like to kind of fall back and I'd like to talk to you about how you. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you started out basically like many of us, sort of as a mystery fan, a Sherlock Holmes fan, and a kind of a casual book collector. Is that right? Am I right about that?
I was a heavy reader of both Sherlock Holmes and other mysteries. And then I started to become a little bit more serious as a collector. So it sounds like I was a casual collector, but the fact is I had no money. And so that made me more casual than I would have been if I'd had money. And so, yeah, I would buy the occasional book. I'd add a few things to my shelves from time to time, but it was really just lack of funds that held me back.
I can relate to that. So, well, that's interesting. So, but you never thought. I mean, you didn't start your professional adult life as a bookseller.
No. Well, my professional adult life, I started out as delivering newspapers when I was 12 years old, but that's a different profession. No, I started out as a sports writer in my early years, first the New York Daily News, and then became director of publicity at ABC Sports, which I left to write the Reasoner Report for Harry Reasoner, for those old enough to remember. He was one of the first people on 60 Minutes, but before that he had his own show, which I wrote for a couple of years. And then after the Reason Report, I became a freelance writer and started the Mysterious Press in 1975. And the first books came out in 1976, both of which, but I had the two books, my first two books came out simultaneously, both of which had Sherlockian connections. One was a book, a parody cycle called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which was a very rare periodical published in England at the turn of the 19th century. And I collected those in one book with an introduction by Philip Jose Farmer. And the second book was a collection of short stories, non-Sherlockian, but by Robert L. Fish, who became well-known in the Sherlockian community for his Sherlock Holmes of Bagel Street, the funniest parodies ever written to this day, in my view.
Hey, I agree with you. They're the best. They are the best. So you were okay. So I had that backwards. So you were a publisher before you were a bookseller.
Correct. I was doing everything single. It was a single proprietorship in every way. I mean, I would pick a book. I would edit the book. I would do the contract. I would write the flap copy and do all of that. I'd hire the artist to do the jacket. I would do the proofreading. I would do everything. I would send out review copies. In those days, before computers, in fact, before Xerox machines, believe it or not, that's how old I am. I would sit down and type a letter and put it in an envelope.
You kids don't remember or don't know the glory of the typewriter.
Yeah, you know what a typewriter is? And I would put it in an envelope and mail it and say, I published a book. Would you be interested in buying a copy? Because I had a lot of friends who were book collectors and book people in general and booksellers. And so I would sit down, type these letters, just offering my books one at a time, which is a very time-consuming process. And then if I would get an order, I would have to do the banking, and then I would type the invoices, and then wrap the book and take it to the post office. And this went on for a little while. And it was really, it was very time consuming and not lucrative at all. Obviously, I wasn't making any money. In fact, I wasn't breaking even. And then I published a book by Robert Bloch. My friend Bob Fish, Bob and I had at that now had become friends. I took him to a little mystery conference and rented a table. I think the table rental was $10, and asked Bob to sit there for an hour or two to sign books for people, which we did. I think we sold like 10 books, like big day, you know. And at one point he came and said, "Listen, I'm having lunch with a friend. You want to join us?" And I said, "What a nice thing. Sure, I'd love to." His friend turned out to be Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho.
Oh, yes, I know who he is, for sure.
Well, but not everybody watching does.
He wrote Psycho.
He wrote Psycho.
And a lot of other stuff, too.
He wrote a lot of other stuff, but everybody knows Psycho because of the movie. So that's why I usually identify him that way, which is not fair to him because he wrote a lot of other very interesting stuff. But we went to lunch, and at the lunch, Bob Fish was very generous, very generous person. And he said, "Otto, you're publishing me, but this is the guy you should be publishing." And I said, "Well, yeah, but of course it's Robert Bloch, you know, and that could never happen." And Bob Bloch said, "Well, what do you have in mind?" And I told him, and he said, I could do that." And this was the beginning of my downfall, because I was printing in those days 1,000 copies of the book, and priced it at exactly 1,000, priced them at exactly $10, because I was doing discounts for booksellers and all of that. So I wanted to keep the math easy. I wrote a check for the full advance so that if I didn't have to write royalty reports. I was just trying to do it as simply as I possibly could. So I printed 1,000 copies plus 250 copies numbered and signed, limited, in a slipcase. The first time anybody who published mystery fiction did limited editions, the first one. And all of a sudden, I'm getting orders from libraries and booksellers from all over the country. And I'm typing invoices so fast, I'm trying to wrap books. I got my brother to help me pack books a few times because I just couldn't keep up. I did a second printing of another 1,000. And then I did a second book with Bob. And I said, I can't do this. And I was living in an apartment in the Bronx. So I couldn't get any help. You can't hire secretarial help and say, "Oh, could you come up to my apartment in the Bronx to type invoices for me?" And so I started to look for a place in New York with an extra room, a rent in Manhattan that I could rent with an extra room as an office. And I couldn't afford the rent, so it was hopeless. So I wound up, and this sounds like a punchline, but it's really true. I wound up buying a building in Midtown Manhattan. It was kind of right behind Carnegie Hall, if you remember 56th Street.
I remember it very fondly.
Yeah. And Carnegie Hall, of course, was on 57th and went all the way through to 56th, was just right up the street from my store. And so this New York was being taxed to death in those days and was going bankrupt. And this man who owned the building, an elderly gentleman, wanted to get out of New York because real estate taxes didn't go down and other taxes went up, and he just couldn't afford to keep the building anymore. And so he sold it. My life savings was $2,050. And I used $2,000 as the down payment for this building, which cost $177,000, which in New York today, you could not get a studio apartment of one room in a so-so neighborhood. But it was,
I have to assume it was you rolled the dice, but I think it had to be, I mean, I'm sure it paid off because I very fondly remember that space. I remember, I know real estate went through the roof in New York, etc. But I remember that space. There was that window, the window. It was like sidewalk level, and you always had this tremendous amount of, the new books and some collectible books and some artifacts in there, and very evocative. And you would go in, for those of you who remember the store on 56th Street. I think everybody remembers the spiral staircase.
And the spiral staircase by doing that with their fingers too.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, yes, very fondly remembered.
Yeah, I love that building. The place downtown. I moved down to Tribeca 15 years ago, as you know, and it's much bigger.
Oh yes,
it's like 3 times the size, but it's a box. It's a big box, and it doesn't have the character of the old building. It was a brownstone, graystone house with a spiral staircase and a couple of steps and corners.
yes.
It just had an old Dickensian feel to it. And I lived right above it, on the floor above the bookshop. It was where I lived. So it was very Dickensian, and I really liked it. I'm happy here, but my office is in the basement, as we just discussed. I'm now in the basement. If you remember my old office, I had the best office in New York. Floor to ceiling.
I do remember it. Well, I'll tell you what I remember about it. I remember there was this short passageway that went back to this inner sanctum.
Yeah.
Which I felt like I was not a status to get. We would look back and say, "Oh, there's Otto's office. Look, it's Otto's office." And it's like, look at those shelves. What's on those shelves? That's what I remember.
Well, yeah, a lot of that was my collection for many years, and then the rare books started to become more. It became more common for me to have more rare books and out of print books, and so I needed some of those shelves for that. I packed up books and put them in cartons, and expanded the number of rare books there. Here we have the downstairs with a lot of space, as you know. Not to mention all the shelves upstairs. There's so much more space for books now, so I don't need quite that big office that I had. Although I miss it because it was really beautiful.
It was. I mean, you did eventually invite me in at some point, and I remember thinking, all right, this is a good day. So I want to ask you about something. I want to ask you about, it's something that I am actually interested in myself and think about sometimes, and that's that connection, the sort of relationship between book publisher and bookseller. And, I mean, as you all know, I publish, but we sell books directly too, and it's not as uncommon, I think, as I've learned, that book publishers become booksellers or vice versa. And what is the why do you think that is? I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
It's the love of books. It's the love of books, and if you want to make a living at it, you explore whatever opportunities there are. Remember, some of the big famous publishers of today, like Putnam, began as a bookshop. G.P. Putnam's Sons. Scribner's had a great bookshop on Fifth Avenue, in addition to their publishing company. Harper, what was Harper and Harper Brothers years ago, was a bookshop as well as a publishing company, which then became Harper and Row, and then nowadays it's Harper Collins. So there was a great history of books, and I'm probably missing others. Remember, the Shakespeare Company in Paris is maybe the most famous bookshop in the world, and they published Ulysses by James Joyce, among some other books. So there's a long tradition of it. So the reason, just to go back to my buying that building, it gave me space, because I thought, now I have extra space for my publishing company. But it actually had quite a bit of space on the ground floor, which was 2 steps below street level. And then I had installed the spiral staircase. I want to do that, the spiral staircase, which then became, because I said, now I have all this space, wouldn't it be fun to have a bookshop? I didn't know anything about being a bookseller. But if I didn't know anything about being a publisher before that, I just made it up as I went along. I made every mistake that it's possible for anybody to make. But now I had a bookshop. I thought, gee, I could be sitting there and reading and talking to customers about books and hand selling books to people. What fun that would be. I was inspired by Christopher Morley.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And then you open the bookshop and it's like, oh my God, the amount of work. It begins really when the store closes. We were open for 8 hours a day, 11 to 7. I was a late night person, so we started the day at 11. It's my bookshop. I can make any hours I want. But at 7 is where you do the reordering and you do the bill paying and you do the restocking of shelves and all the stuff that it does, that is needed. It is much more work than anybody thinks. I always find it amusing because just like opening a little bed and breakfast or a bar, opening a bookshop is everybody's kind of dream, and I frequently hear, when I retire, I'm going to open a bookshop. It's like, retire? You have no idea what you're facing, man. But it's great fun, I have to say. It really beats honest work. No.
But I think I can relate to what you're saying. It's people will ask me sometimes, how do you find time to do all this stuff? And it's like, well, you just got to love doing it, right? You got to love books. You got to love. You've created something that never existed before, and now you're selling it to people when they want it. So,
yeah, it's
wonderful.
I have to make clear that I'm not complaining about this at all. I love my work, but people have it slightly wrong. They say, "You love to work." So, no, I love my work. I don't love to work. I'd rather
your work.
Yeah, I'd rather play than work. Let's get that clear. I'm blessed to be able to do the kind of work that I do. I'm very fortunate, and I do love my work. But I would rather play. I'd rather go out drinking and eating and hanging out with my friends or go to a Yankees game. A lot of other things that are great to do than work.
Hey, Otto, let's take a break for a minute so we can hear a word from our sponsor. All right, we're back with Otto Penzler. I want to ask you about your publishing company or your publishing history. I mean, many of us know you as a bookseller, but I remember I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of your publishing history. I know that you read manuscripts constantly. I know that you've published some tremendous books, but I think my personal first encounter was the magazine.
The Armchair Detective magazine.
Yes. Talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
It was started, this was a great magazine. One of the great things that happened in the history of mystery fiction was Alan J. Human starting a magazine called The Armchair Detective, which he did on a mimeograph machine in the basement of his home in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. And Anthony Boucher reviewed the magazine in the New York Times, and I think probably in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine as well. And why it was so great is that it was a community, it was a place where mystery readers, fans, collectors, writers, publishing people had a place to meet. They could meet in the pages of the Armchair Detective. And it was a labor of love for Al. And almost everybody that I knew who was interested in the mystery world was subscribing, and we would talk to each other. We would write to each other and say, "You've got to get Armchair. You've got to subscribe to this thing." And at one point, after he had been doing it for 9 years, a publishing company out in California called Publishers Inc. Took it over. And made it more professional. They actually printed it instead of running off copies in a mimeograph machine. And then he had his children collate the pages and staple them before he mailed them out. But Publishers Inc. then took it over and made it more professional. And they were going to let it die. It was losing money. It was losing a lot of money. And it's a lot of work. And rather than let it die, I had just opened the bookshop. So I had space. I was running Mysterious Press and the bookshop, but at least I had space. So I said, rather than let it die, I'll take it over. I didn't have to pay for it, but I took over its debts, which were substantial. Substantial for somebody with no money, because I had no money. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I figured it out, and I hired somebody 1 day a week to handle subscriptions. It eventually became a full-time job, but in those days, and I kept making it better. We printed it. I went to full color covers. I added pages. It had, Armchair Detective was 24 pages, some issues, some 32 pages. I got it over 100 pages with square backs, and really did. Anytime it looked like we were going to break even, I decided, I'm going to make it bigger and better by doing different things. And then I had a dreadful time in my life. The woman that I loved more than life itself left me. And I was afunctional. I couldn't do anything. All I could do was cry. And so I gave the magazine to the woman who was running it at the time. And I think she ran it for like 3 issues, something like that, and disappeared. Never heard from her again. We received mail. IRS letters were showing up, and we kept saving her mail to try to take care of her. And it wasn't mine anymore, but it was a horrible thing. People sending in checks. I'm sure there were hundreds of letters saying, "Where's my issue?" So it died after I had run it for about 10 years. I'm guessing roughly 10, 11 years. And then Judy just disappeared one day.
I was unaware of how it ended. I just know that
it ended, and I couldn't take
heyday. It was a thing to behold, I think.
Oh, wonderful. Scholars were writing for it, good authors who knew how to write well. Not every scholar does. They may have a great passion for an author or a book or a genre or whatever, and enthusiastically wrote learnedly about it, but maybe not so beautifully as writers. And but everybody wrote. It was such a forum. Wonderful writers wrote for it on a pretty regular basis, and I was really proud of the way it turned out. I was so heartbroken the way it ended.
Yeah, it's a shame, but it's fondly remembered, and it set the bar, I think, for some of the magazines that have come in its wake, which, in my opinion, have never quite lived up to the Armchair Detective. But
nobody was as good as the Armchair Detective.
It was so good. It was something else. Well, I want to talk to you also about. Let's talk a little bit about Sherlock Holmes. I know that you have mentioned that you do not consider yourself a quote unquote great Sherlockian.
I'm not.
But you are a Sherlockian. You are a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, right?
Yeah, for more than 40 years.
Mm-hmm. King of Bohemia, right?
I'm the king of Bohemia.
Yeah, that's
my investiture is the king of Bohemia.
Bohemia, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what is it? I'm just going to ask kind of a generic question. Why do you think, what is it about Sherlock Holmes, and why does he seem to have this? I mean, many Sherlockians are mystery readers and love the entire genre of detective fiction and crime fiction. But what is it? Why does Sherlock Holmes seem to sort of be his own thing? What is it about Holmes, do you think?
It's a great question. I think because we love the two sides of this character. One is the eccentricity, his bizarre behavior, his bizarre habits, but also that logical, rational mind. Those two things don't always go together. Maybe they do in some mathematicians or some musicians who have to be good mathematicians generally. But I think that appeals to us so much. There are other things that don't have to do only with the character, with that one character that makes him so appealing to us. One of those things is the cast of characters with whom he's surrounded. Obviously, Dr. Watson, but also the Baker Street Irregulars and some of the police who become familiar. Naturally, Mrs. Hudson, and one of my favorite characters, Mycroft, who unfortunately doesn't appear very often in the canon. I wish he had appeared more because he's such an absolutely fascinating character, I think. So I think that's also a great appeal to the Sherlock Holmes stories, if not Sherlock Holmes himself, but also the general ambiance, the time, the era, the smog, the street, the gas lamps, the sound of the hansom cab. All of those things, as Vincent Starrett so beautifully stated it, where it's always 1895.
I want to ask you also about, I think it's important that, it's not important that Sherlockians understand or read a lot of other period detective fiction. I mean, I think you can completely enjoy Sherlock Holmes, just by reading Sherlock Holmes. But I have always found that reading his contemporaries, or the detectives that he inspired, sort of enhances the experience and also the appreciation. Is that something that you might have, you would agree with? And if so, who do you think who can you recommend, or who do you like from that same sort of era?
It's one of the things that I do to earn a living is anthologies. I'm a fairly prolific anthologist, and most of my books have involved stories from a similar era. They've either used a Sherlock Holmes story or two, or other writers of that time. In fact, the book I'm ready to deliver, I finished it, is the big book of Victorian mystery stories. So I've read a lot of them. One of the things that is remarkable for me is how readable the Sherlock Holmes stories remain to this day. Very unlike most of the writers from that time, who were far more verbose, who lacked the clarity and the simplicity of Conan Doyle. The underrated writer of that time to me is L.T. Mead. L.T. Mead was a very prolific writer. She wrote probably 50 or 60 books for girls, schoolgirl time and that sort of thing, but also wrote dozens of crime novels and hundreds of short stories. And they hold up really, really well. They're great fun to read. A lot of the writers well known from that era are a bit more of a struggle. You can read them with pleasure. I'm not saying there's no pleasure in them, but they're overlong. Some of the dialogue and other writing is fairly stilted, unlike Mead, and certainly unlike Doyle.
Yeah, I have always been struck by how, even now, how modern the writing style, Conan Doyle's writing style was.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it was, I don't know, he's so underrated critically, and yet he sort of pioneered a more natural and accessible style. So it's good to hear you say that. It's interesting. I've not read L.T. Mead, so I'm going to put her on my list.
You should do this. Things like this: The Sorceress of the Strand, The Brotherhood of the Seven Kings.
Titles, my goodness, how can you?
They're great titles, and each of those books has a great central character, a villainous in both cases, they're charming women who are evil, really evil, and they're beautifully told stories with great surprises. I strongly recommend them.
Or maybe I'll just wait for the big book of Victorian detective.
Well, that won't be out until October of 2021.
All right, I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, go knock yourself out. Get some stories before that.
Okay, so speaking of books that have come out or that people should read, I do want to recommend this one.
Oh,
Yes.
my little biblio memoir.
Yes. So this is Otto's biblio memoir, Mysterious Obsession, and it's wonderful. And this was a book that well, first of all, I really loved it, and it really enjoyed sort of picking it up off the nightstand or picking it up in my armchair in the evening and reading your adventures in book collecting, because that's what it's about. And it's lovely. So I'd like to just talk about a couple. What's your favorite experience that you chronicled in the book here of book collecting?
Well, thanks for plugging my book. I have to say, the Sherlockians who know me will quickly nod their heads in agreement when I say that, like Sherlock Holmes, I do not number humility among the virtues.
Yeah.
But I've always been very shy, very nervous about my writing. Because I've been reading for so long and editing for so long, so many great writers. I mean, I've edited James Crumley, I've edited Joyce Carol Oates, I've edited James Ellroy, I've edited Elmore Leonard. So I know the difference between good writing and pedestrian writing. And
well, do you think your early career as a writer? I mean, I know that it's an entirely different style of writing. But do you think that helped you at all, or
as an editor? You mean?
Or as a writer? Because you were talking about how you started as a sports writer and you wrote for.
I've written my whole life, and I don't like writing. It's just such hard work. I grew up thinking I wanted to be a writer. Again, like opening a bookshop. Oh, what fun to be a writer! No, it's such hard work. I'd rather do yard work than write. It's so hard. So when I decided to write this little biblio memoir, it came about because I brought my books were going off to auction. So my beautiful library, all of the books were going, and my staff were really book people, that are book people. And so I decided I would have everybody come up to the house and I'd show them the library, cook lunch for them, and so on. And as I walked through the library, I'd pull books off and tell them, oh, this is an interesting book, or why this book is interesting, how I got this book, and so on. And at the end of it, Charles, the publisher of all four of my publishing companies, said, I have an idea. Why don't you pull down a bunch of the books? I'll come back next weekend and photograph them, and you write these stories that you told us today. I think people would find it interesting. And I thought, oh, okay, I hate writing, but okay. So I did, and I wrote it, and we published it in the bookshop. And Charles took these pictures. It's a beautiful book. It has a frontispiece.
I agree. I love it. And that frontispiece, was that your library?
It's my library. It was my library, yeah.
Wow.
I know. It's a cathedral to books. It's just so beautiful.
It looks like the Trinity Library in Dublin or something.
It looks like it. No, it's better, but it was patterned after the Bodleian and the Trinity libraries. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the book, and I said, well, nobody's going to publish this, but since I've done all the work, let's publish it in the bookshop. We'll do 100 copies. And Charles said, no, let's do 500. And so we argued about it, and I said, so we settled on 250 because I didn't think anybody would want to buy it. And we announced it. And I'm not making this up. We sold out in 24 hours.
I know, because I missed the first edition.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
It was the most amazing response. So we immediately did another 250, which we have also sold out.
I got one of those, but.
Okay. So we're going to do a third.
Lose people.
I'm sorry?
I said, you snooze, you lose. Hello.
So I'm going to do a third printing, and I'm saying to Charles, we should only do 100. And he said, well, don't you ever learn? So I don't know. But we'll do it in September. We're going to do a third printing. Anyway, the response, the number of people who had good things to say about it on Facebook and other places, Twitter. I'm told I don't have a Twitter account. I don't do Twitter. But the response was so heartwarming to me. I remain astonished by it. And so I'm very proud of the book now, I have to say, because other people liked it so much, even if I wasn't sure about it. My best story in there, I don't know what my best story is.
What's your favorite? What's your favorite? Because you went to the shelves and you picked the ones that you wanted to talk about.
I picked 21 stories because I had 40 books. We took pictures of 40 books, but it's only 21 stories because the other stories were so similar to the ones that I ran that it didn't make sense to run it in the book. That's why the book is on the slim side, which I recognize. It was the only complaint, which was it's too short. There should have been more stories.
Well, one of the things I really appreciated about it is that you introduced me to a few titles that I didn't know about, and I love that you took delight in finding some of these more obscure and kind of lesser known authors, and yet you took delight in finding that rare volume of their work, and I don't know, I thought that was really wonderful.
Every story in there really mattered to me. But I'll tell you one quick story, if I may, because it was the most extraordinary act of generosity. I've been collecting World War I poets, and I wrote an article about Rupert Brooke, a great World War I poet who was killed in the war, whose life was cut short when he was extremely young. And he was maybe my favorite of the World War I poets. So I wrote about it, and I got a letter from a man who collected not Rupert Brooke, but he collected Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ernest Hemingway. He called them his Hem and Haw collection. And he wrote and said, what a beautiful article. Do you collect other things and so on? The very short version of this story was that we became very good pen pals. And one day he visited me in New York. We went to dinner together. He was very wealthy. He was an executive in a suburb of Detroit, and he invited me to his home. And I went because I went to Michigan to a homecoming, and so I made the weekend to be with him at his house. So I stayed with him. And in our conversation, he had mentioned somehow, I have no memory of how, that his wife loved pistachio nuts. So as a little house gift, I bought a 3-pound bucket of shelled pistachio nuts for his wife. When I left, he said, and he wasn't being facetious, this is key to the story. He said, you were so generous to bring pistachio nuts. I'd like to give you a going away gift. And what he gave me was a first edition of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, his first novel, and the first edition of Red Harvest, Dashiell Hammett's first novel. Beautiful copies of both books.
Wow.
The Red Harvest sold at auction for $60,000. And the buyer had to pay 25% commission on top of it. That was the book that C.E. Fraser Clark gave to me as a going away gift.
That is amazing.
It's an extraordinary story.
It's a lesson. There's a life lesson there, and generosity.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you. It's amazing, Otto.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
So that's one of the stories I tell in my little biblio memoir.
That's great. That is really good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to we're getting close to our time. I can't believe there's so many things I could talk to you about.
Oh,
it's true. And
I haven't been keeping track, so I'm glad you
I've always got my eye on the clock. So, but but what do you what do you see for the you know how do you see the future of mystery and detective fiction? What can you anticipate where it's headed, or trends, or what do you think? How vibrant is this genre that we
Uh,
all love so much?
the genre is so incredibly vibrant. The New York Times used to run 15 bestsellers every week. Now it's down to 10. And for years, at least half of that list were crime fiction, mystery fiction. Mystery, not necessarily just detective fiction. I define it a little more broadly to include crime stories and suspense stories. Even espionage and thrillers are, to me, mystery stories. And that has become, I think, pure detective stories are much rarer than they used to be. They're really hard to write, especially in this day with all the science, the forensics and so on. Writing a pure detective story is much harder. So thrillers are much more common. Police procedurals have become more common. The biggest change to me in the last 10 or 15 years has been the number of literary writers who have incorporated crime and suspense, murder, and its aftermath into their mainstream novels. And on the other side, the number of mystery writers who have taken so much more care in character development and in their style, the poetry of their prose, and become much more literary. And so the biggest trend is really a return to the early years of mystery fiction, where the great writers like Poe, Dickens, Wilkie Collins, the great literary writers of their time were writing crime novels. And nobody ever made the distinction, oh, he's writing a mystery, oh, he's a literary writer. No, they were just really good books. And we're seeing a lot more of that today. And it's a welcome change.
It's interesting because, for many decades in the 20th century, crime fiction or detective fiction was sort of seen as slumming if you went down to write a crime novel or a detective story. You were just sort of, but I have noticed that that both, just as you described, but the crime stories are getting more literary, and more literary writers are beginning to write crime. That's very interesting. I would love to see a revival of the pure detective story. I think, but you're right. The plots.
It's hard. It's hard. People try it, but in truth, most of the great plots have been used by Agatha Christie. So, in order to come up with a new motive, a new murder method.
I've been watching a mystery movie on television or in the movie or something, or even reading something. It's like, oh, this is Agatha Christie, or this is Dorothy Sayers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or the solution.
Or Sherlock Holmes. I've seen that
or
too.
Sherlock Holmes. The solution is usually because somebody confesses.
Right. It's
or they brag about it.
Confess.
That's the way crimes are solved today. People brag about it on Facebook or on Twitter,
right?
And the cops watch it. They catch them.
Hello. Well, Otto, this has been great. We are close to the end of our time. So many things we could have spoken about, but it's great to have you here. And thanks for joining us. I know that everybody is, we all love books, and it's been great talking to you about books and book publishing, which is an interest of mine, and book collecting, and writing and editing and everything. So I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Steve. I'm sorry to disappoint your audience by not having more to say about Sherlock Holmes and nothing interesting to say about him at all or original.
No, are you kidding? No, it's been great. It's been wonderful. And I may even ask you back, because I have this long list right over here of topics to talk to Otto about, and I got to about a third of them. So
Oh, I'm easy.
I
Just
may
ask
call
me.
you
I
back
show
and
up
go, Otto, be on the show again.
anytime.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Otto. It's been wonderful. And I do look forward to getting back to the store eventually. And
Not this year. It looks like, sad to say.
probably not, but we'll see. I mean, probably not this year, but hopefully sooner than later.
We're here. I just signed a new 10-year lease, so I'm ready.
I'm very happy to hear that. That's great.
Okay.
I want to get back to the basement. So,
Okay.
all right. Okay, great.
Thanks again.
And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. Again, I want to thank you for all the kind words and feedback we've been getting. I think we're kind of on a roll. So if you've enjoyed this podcast and these series of interviews, share it with your friends and pass the word. We love being able to bring these to you. We do think it kind of closes the gap in these separated times that we are living through. So until next time, and you'll want to come back next time because we have another terrific guest. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you then.